When I moved into my new home, it felt like a turning point in my life. After years of cramped apartments and noisy neighbors, I finally had a place to call my own. It was a modest bungalow in a quiet suburb, not extravagant but filled with potential. The neighborhood had an idyllic charm: tree-lined streets, kids riding bikes, and older residents who had been there for decades, always quick to offer a friendly wave. For the first time in years, I felt like I had found peace. My weekends were spent planting flowers, painting shutters, and chatting with the neighbors. Life was settling into a comfortable routine. The house next to mine had been empty when I moved in, which only added to the tranquility. That changed about 3 weeks later when a moving truck pulled into the driveway. A man stepped out, mid-50s, tall, stocky, with gray-streaked hair and a rough demeanor. His clothes were dusty, as though he had spent years working outdoors, and his expression was unreadable. When he glanced in my direction, his eyes held a cold intensity that sent a ripple of unease through me. I waved out of habit, but he didn't respond. Instead, he looked at me for a moment longer before walking inside. I shook off the discomfort, chalking it up to a rough first impression. A couple of weeks went by before I had my first real interaction with him. I was out in the yard trimming hedges along the fence when I caught sight of him standing on his porch, arms folded across his chest, watching me. At first, I ignored it, thinking he'd eventually look away, but he didn't. His gaze was fixed on me, unblinking and calculating. Feeling the awkwardness intensify, I decided to address it. "Hey there," I called out, mustering a friendly tone. "How's it going?" He didn't answer right away. He just kept staring, like he was trying to size me up. Finally, after what felt like a long pause, he nodded slightly. "You live alone?" he asked in a gravelly voice. The question caught me off guard, and I hesitated before answering. Yeah, just me," I replied cautiously. He nodded again, his eyes narrowing as he muttered under his breath, "That's good. Makes things easier." I forced a laugh, unsure how to respond, and turned back to my hedges, but the rest of the afternoon felt off. Even after he went inside, I couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. That night, lying in bed, I replayed the interaction in my head, telling myself I was being paranoid. But deep down, I couldn't ignore the instinct that something wasn't quite right about him. Over the following weeks, my neighbor, whose name I later learned was Carl, began to display increasingly strange behavior. I'd often see him pacing up and down his driveway late at night, muttering to himself. Sometimes, he left his trash cans out for days after collection, and on a few occasions, I found random items, like an empty soda can or an old shoe, thrown into my yard. Once, I even caught him standing by the fence in the early hours of the morning, staring directly at my house. It wasn't just his erratic behavior, there was a darker, more threatening undercurrent to it all. One evening, I came home from work to find my mailbox smashed in. It looked as though someone had taken a hammer to it, leaving it crumpled and unusable. While I couldn't prove it was Carl, I had an unsettling feeling he was behind it. After that, the tension between us escalated. At night, I would hear him outside, shouting angrily into the darkness. His voice would carry through the quiet streets, sometimes loud and enraged, other times low and guttural, like he was arguing with himself. On several occasions, I debated confronting him, but every time I remembered the way he had looked at me during our first meeting, the cold, detached stare, and I thought better of it. I didn't know what he was capable of, and the risk didn't feel worth it. The final straw came on a Saturday afternoon. I was sitting on my porch, a book in hand, trying to enjoy the last hours of sunlight. The sound of shattering glass jolted me upright. I looked over to see Carl standing in his yard, a broken beer bottle at his feet and another clutched in his hand. He was glaring at me, his face twisted in anger, and his posture unsteady as if he had been drinking all afternoon. "What's your problem?" he yelled, his voice slurred but filled with hostility. I froze, unsure how to react. "You think you're better than me, don't you? Sitting there like you own the place," he continued, staggering closer to the edge of his yard. "I don't know what you're talking about," I replied cautiously, trying to keep my voice steady. My heart was pounding, and every instinct was telling me to retreat inside, but I stood my ground. "Don't play dumb," he snapped, his tone venomous. "I see the way you look at me. You think I'm some kind of freak, don't you? His words sent a chill through me. He was clearly looking for a fight, but I didn't want to give him one. "Look, I'm not trying to cause trouble," I said, taking a step back toward my door. "Let's just forget about it, okay?" For a moment, it seemed like he might lunge at me. His fists were clenched, his chest heaving with labored breaths. But then, just as suddenly as his rage had erupted, it subsided. He muttered something under his breath, turned, and stumbled back toward his house. That night, I lay in bed replaying the scene in my mind, the tension still thick in the air. I knew this wasn't over. His anger had reached a boiling point, and I couldn't predict what he might do next. Sure enough, the harassment continued. Late at night, I'd hear him yelling outside my house, sometimes calling my name, daring me to confront him. Other times, I'd find small acts of vandalism, scratches on my car, overturned garbage bins, that I was certain were his doing. The fear became unbearable, and I knew I couldn't live like this any longer. After a particularly terrifying night, during which he pounded on my door at 2 a.m., I decided to call the police. They arrived quickly, but Carl was back inside his house by the time they showed up. Without concrete evidence, there was little they could do besides take my statement and warn him to stay away. The final breaking point came a few weeks later when I caught him in the act. I was preparing to leave for work when I heard a loud crash outside. I ran to the window and saw Carl standing by my car, a brick in his hand, the driver's side window shattered. That was it. I called the police immediately, reporting the damage and demanding they take action. This time, they arrested him for property destruction, but I knew it wasn't enough. Even with Carl in custody, I couldn't shake the lingering dread that he would come back. The following morning, I put my house up for sale. My dream of owning my own home, of finding peace in a quiet neighborhood, had been shattered. Within a few months, I was gone, leaving behind not just the house but the shadow of fear Carl had cast over my life. Even now, in my new home, I can't fully relax. I still find myself checking the locks multiple times a night and glancing over my shoulder, haunted by the memory of a neighbor who turned my dream into a nightmare. When my wife and I first moved into what we thought would be our forever home, it seemed like the perfect place to start the next chapter of our lives. It was a picturesque two-story house in a quiet, well-kept neighborhood with tree-lined streets and plenty of space for us to build a family. The neighbors were welcoming, and everything about the area felt safe and inviting. Among the friendly faces we encountered during those initial days, one person stood out, Mrs. Hathaway. She lived in the house next door, an older woman who carried herself with a mix of warmth and intensity that was hard to ignore. She introduced herself the very day we arrived, knocking on our door with a casserole dish in hand and a smile that seemed just a little too wide. "Welcome to the neighborhood," she chirped in a high-pitched voice, her enthusiasm bordering on overbearing. "I've lived here for over 30 years. I've seen so many families come and go, but I always make sure to look out for the new folks. If you ever need anything at all, just let me know." My wife and I exchanged polite smiles, thanked her for the gesture, and assured her we'd settle in just fine. At first, we chalked up her bubbly personality to a mix of small-town charm and perhaps a bit of loneliness. For the first few days, Mrs. Hathaway's presence was harmless. She'd wave enthusiastically from her porch whenever we stepped outside, occasionally calling out well-meaning but unsolicited advice about gardening or local services. It seemed like innocent neighborly kindness, and though her enthusiasm felt excessive, we dismissed it as nothing more than friendliness. But as the weeks passed, her behavior began to cross boundaries. Every time my wife went outside, whether to check the mail, water the plants, or take out the trash, Mrs. Hathaway would appear, as if she had been watching and waiting for the perfect moment to strike up a conversation. Her questions became personal, and her offers to help started to feel intrusive. Her visits grew more frequent, to the point where they disrupted our daily lives. Sometimes she would knock on our door early in the morning, other times late at night, always carrying something, freshly baked cookies, gardening tools, or magazines she thought we might like. The first few times, we accepted her gifts with strained politeness, but her persistence began to feel like an invasion. One evening, just as we had settled on the couch for a quiet movie night, there was an abrupt knock at the door. Startled, I opened it to find Mrs. Hathaway standing there, a basket of muffins in her hands and a disturbingly cheerful smile plastered on her face. "I thought you might enjoy these," she said sweetly. But there was something unsettling in the way her eyes lingered, as if she were looking past me into our home rather than at me. My wife and I exchanged uneasy glances after she left. "This is starting to feel weird," I said, voicing the discomfort we both felt. My wife nodded, her brow furrowed. "She's just being friendly," she replied, but her tone was uncertain. "Still, showing up this late? It's strange." The visits didn't stop. If anything, they became more frequent and increasingly bizarre. She'd knock just to ask if we needed anything or to drop off random trinkets, an old cookbook, a tiny potted plant, or a stack of yellowed magazines. It wasn't the gifts themselves that unsettled us, but the way they felt like an excuse to insert herself into our lives. One afternoon, as my wife and I worked in the garden, Mrs. Hathaway sat on her porch, watching us intently. Every time we glanced in her direction, she didn't look away. She simply stared, her gaze unflinching and oddly possessive. "She's creeping me out," my wife whispered, her voice laced with unease. I nodded in agreement, but I wasn't sure how to handle it without escalating the situation. We decided to create some distance, keeping our interactions polite but firm whenever she approached. We hoped she'd take the hint. She didn't. One evening, we came home to find Mrs. Hathaway standing in our backyard, her frail silhouette illuminated by the porch light. She wasn't doing anything, just standing there, looking around as though the yard was hers. My heart sank. My wife gripped my arm tightly, her voice trembling. "What is she doing here?" she whispered. Summoning my courage, I stepped outside and called to her. "Mrs. Hathaway, what are you doing?" She turned to face me, her expression a mix of sweetness and something darker. "Oh, I was just checking on the garden," she said, her tone light and casual. "I thought you could use some help with those roses." Her words felt like an excuse, her presence invasive. "You can't just come into our yard like that," I said firmly, trying to keep my voice steady. "We appreciate your help, but this is our home, and we need you to respect our privacy." For a moment, her smile faltered, and something flickered in her eyes, a flash of irritation or anger. Then, just as quickly, the sweetness returned. "Of course, dear," she said softly, her voice dripping with insincerity. "I didn't mean to upset you." That night, my wife and I had a long conversation. We couldn't deny it anymore. Mrs. Hathaway's behavior wasn't just eccentric, it was invasive and unsettling. We agreed to keep our distance, to establish clear boundaries, but deep down, we both knew it might not be enough. Over the next few days, I installed a lock on the backyard gate and started checking the doors and windows more frequently. But the unease lingered. Every time we left the house, I half expected to see her lurking nearby, watching us with that unsettling smile. It wasn't until we discovered the cameras that our discomfort turned to outright fear. My wife had been dusting the living room when she found the first one, a tiny, old-fashioned camera hidden behind a stack of books on the shelf. At first, we thought it might be a relic left behind by the previous owners, but then we found another in the kitchen, tucked into a corner where it was almost invisible, and a third in the hallway. The realization hit us like a punch to the gut. Someone, most likely Mrs. Hathaway, had been in our home, watching us, recording us without our knowledge. I stormed over to her house, clutching one of the cameras in my hand, my anger barely contained. When she opened the door, her expression was calm, almost serene. "What's this?" I demanded, holding up the camera. She didn't flinch, didn't even try to deny it. Instead, she smiled that same unsettling smile. "I was just looking out for you," she said softly. "Making sure you were safe." That was the breaking point. We called the police, but despite their best efforts, they couldn't find enough evidence to charge her. The cameras could have been placed by anyone, they said. Without concrete proof, there was nothing they could do. Mrs. Hathaway stopped visiting after that, but her presence loomed like a shadow. We could feel her watching, even if we couldn't see her. The fear became unbearable. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind outside felt like a reminder that she was still there, just beyond the walls of our home. We decided to leave. Selling the house was a difficult decision, but staying wasn't an option. Within a few months, we were gone, leaving behind the charming house and the nightmare that had come with it. Even now, in our new home, the memory of Mrs. Hathaway haunts us, a chilling reminder that not all neighbors have good intentions. The unsettling events with Mrs. Hathaway reached a tipping point one evening when my wife came to me with a look of sheer panic. "You need to see this," she whispered, her voice trembling. She led me to the living room, pointing to a spot on the shelf where she'd been dusting. Hidden behind a stack of books was a small, old-fashioned camera, its lens aimed toward the center of the room. My stomach twisted as I picked it up, my mind racing. Where did this come from? I asked, though deep down, I already knew the answer. My wife, pale and visibly shaken, gestured toward the kitchen. "There's more," she said, her voice barely audible. We found 2 more cameras, one discreetly tucked into a corner of the kitchen, another concealed in the hallway. They were so small, almost invisible unless you were searching for them. A wave of nausea rolled over me as the reality sank in. Mrs. Hathaway had been in our home, planting these cameras, watching us. The violation of privacy was staggering, and with it came an overwhelming sense of dread. Without saying a word, I grabbed the cameras, stormed next door, and pounded on her door, my anger boiling over. When she opened it, her expression was disturbingly calm, her demeanor unbothered. I held up the cameras, my hands trembling with rage. "What the hell is this?" I demanded. She didn't flinch, her face remaining eerily serene. "I was just looking out for you," she said softly, her tone almost maternal. "I wanted to make sure you were safe." Her words hit me like a slap. I stared at her, struggling to process what I was hearing. "You were spying on us," I said, my voice shaking with disbelief. Her smile didn't waver. "I care about you, dear. I was only trying to protect you." I was at a loss for words. The audacity, the warped logic, it was all too much. Without saying another word, I turned and walked away, my heart pounding as I tried to calm the storm of emotions inside me. Back in the house, I called the police. Officers arrived shortly after, taking our statements and inspecting the cameras. But despite everything, they told us there wasn't enough evidence to charge her. The cameras could have been placed by anyone, they said. Without proof, there was little they could do. Mrs. Hathaway didn't visit after that, but her presence still loomed. Every time we stepped outside, we'd see her peering through her curtains, her gaze following our every move. The sense of paranoia was suffocating. Even the police's suggestion to install security cameras didn't alleviate the unease. The thought of her watching us, lurking just beyond the walls of our home, was inescapable. The breaking point came one night when my wife woke up screaming. I rushed to her side, my heart pounding in terror. She clutched my arm, her eyes wide with fear. "I saw someone," she stammered, "standing in the doorway." I grabbed the nearest object, a lamp, and crept toward the hallway, but when I reached the doorway, there was no one there. The house was silent except for the pounding of my heart. Still, the fear in my wife's voice was real, and I knew we couldn't keep living like this. The next morning, we packed our bags and checked into a hotel, unsure of what to do next. The house no longer felt like a home, it was a prison, its walls echoing with the constant threat of Mrs. Hathaway's obsession. We decided to sell the house. It didn't matter how much we lost in the process, we just needed to get out. Within a few weeks, the sale was finalized, and we left that nightmare behind. Even now, in our new home, the shadow of Mrs. Hathaway lingers. Her obsession, her need to control every aspect of our lives, has left scars we can't erase. Every time I hear a knock at the door or notice a neighbor watching from across the street, I feel that same sense of dread creeping back in. It's a constant reminder that sometimes, the real danger doesn't come from strangers, it's the people who are already too close. The uneasy feeling followed me as I stepped inside, my movements cautious and deliberate. The house seemed just as I'd left it, quiet, untouched, but something was wrong. I couldn't shake the discomfort creeping up my spine. I checked every window, tested the locks, and did my best to convince myself that it was all in my head. Maybe I had left the door slightly ajar in my morning rush, I thought. Fatigue could play tricks on the mind, after all. But just a few days later, it happened again. This time, I was absolutely certain I had locked the door. I remembered the moment vividly, standing in the hallway, key in hand, turning the deadbolt with a deliberate click before heading out for the day. When I returned that evening, my stomach dropped. The door was unlocked. I stood frozen on the porch, my pulse hammering in my ears as I stared at the door. Maybe the lock was faulty, I tried to rationalize. Maybe I hadn't turned it far enough. But as I pushed the door open and stepped inside, that gnawing unease returned, sharper now. The house was too still, the silence heavy, pressing in on me. Moving cautiously from room to room, I checked everything, the windows, the back door, even the closets. Nothing seemed out of place until I entered the kitchen. There, I noticed the drawers where I kept my silverware were slightly open, not wide open, just enough to suggest someone had been rifling through them. My breath caught. I had been in a rush that morning, but I knew I hadn't left the drawers like that. I always closed them. As I scanned the counter, I realized nothing was missing. Still, the idea of someone being in my house left my stomach in knots. Someone had been here, moving things, disturbing the fragile sense of order in my space. Over the next few days, the strange occurrences escalated. I would come home to find little things out of place, a dining chair pulled slightly away from the table, a book moved from its usual spot, the shower curtain drawn back when I distinctly remembered leaving it closed. It was subtle but deliberate, like someone was leaving breadcrumbs just to mess with my mind. The paranoia started to seep into every corner of my life. Every morning before leaving for work, I check and recheck the locks, close all the windows, and draw the curtains tightly. I even began placing small items in specific positions, like makeshift traps, so I could tell if anything had been moved in my absence. It wasn't long before I started suspecting my neighbor, Frank. He lived in the house next door, and though he always seemed friendly enough, there was something unsettling about him. He was the type of person who always seemed to be outside, tinkering in his garage, sitting on his porch, or just lingering in his driveway. His presence felt omnipresent. At first, I had chalked it up to curiosity, maybe even loneliness. But then I noticed the way he seemed to know things he shouldn't. He'd casually mention when I left for work, when I came back, or if I had visitors. It wasn't just idle small talk, it felt intrusive, like he was keeping tabs on me. One evening, I came home to find the lights in my bedroom glowing. A chill ran through me. I never left lights on, not even in a rush. My hand shook as I unlocked the front door and stepped inside, my senses on high alert. I moved through the house cautiously, checking each room and trying to keep my breathing steady. Everything was where it should be, except for one thing. On my nightstand, I found a small keychain with a tiny flashlight attached. I didn't recognize it. It wasn't mine. I hadn't had anyone over in weeks. I stared at it for what felt like an eternity, my mind racing with questions. How had it gotten there? Had Frank been inside my house? Was he trying to mess with me? My unease turned to anger as I grabbed the keychain and stormed next door, adrenaline coursing through me. Frank was sitting on his porch as usual, sipping a beer. He greeted me with a casual smile, but there was something behind it, something smug, as if he knew exactly why I was there. Evening, he said, leaning back in his chair. Everything okay? I held up the keychain, my hand trembling. Did you leave this in my house? I demanded. Frank glanced at the keychain, his expression blank for a moment, before he let out a low chuckle. I have no idea what you're talking about, he said, his tone dripping with mock innocence. Someone's been in my house, I said, my voice trembling with a mix of fear and anger. And I think it's you. Frank raised his hands in mock surrender, his smirk growing wider. Whoa, calm down. I don't know what's going on in your house, but it sure as hell isn't me. Stress can do funny things to people, you know. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to convince myself that I was overreacting, that the paranoia had gotten the better of me. But the way his eyes lingered on me, the slight curl of his lips, it told me everything I needed to know. Frank wasn't innocent. He was enjoying this. The next day, I went out and bought security cameras. If Frank was sneaking into my house, I was going to catch him. I installed them around the property, ensuring every angle was covered. That night, I sat in the dark with my phone in hand, watching the live feeds from the cameras, waiting for something to happen. For a few nights, everything was quiet. No signs of entry, no disturbances. I began to let my guard down, thinking maybe my confrontation had scared him off. But then, late one night, the motion detector went off. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, jolting me awake. Heart pounding, I opened the app and stared at the feed. At first, I saw nothing but shadows stretching across the lawn. But then, a figure emerged, Frank. He was crouched near the side window, his hands fiddling with the latch. My stomach churned as I watched him. He moved with a practiced ease, like he had done this before. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my voice shaking as I whispered to the operator what was happening. As I spoke, I kept my eyes glued to the feed, watching as Frank finally managed to slide the window open and climb inside. My blood ran cold. He was in my house. The police arrived within minutes, their sirens cutting through the silence of the night. They caught Frank red-handed, crouched in my kitchen, rummaging through a drawer. He didn't resist as they hauled him away, but he gave me one last look as he passed, a look that sent a shiver down my spine. It was a twisted smile, full of malice and something else, satisfaction. Frank was charged with trespassing and breaking and entering, but even after his arrest, I couldn't shake the fear that had taken root in me. My home, once a sanctuary, now felt like a place of constant threat. I sold the house a few months later and moved far away, but the memory of Frank's smirk still haunts me. It's a reminder that sometimes, the real monsters aren't lurking in the shadows, they're right next door. The first few weeks in my new place felt like a fresh start. The apartment was small but cozy, with just enough room for me to settle into a comfortable routine. The neighborhood seemed quiet, the kind of place where people minded their own business, and the backyard offered a touch of privacy I hadn't realized I craved. After the nightmare with Frank, this felt like a step forward. My days quickly fell into a predictable rhythm: work, come home, unwind. It was all I had wanted, a space where I could finally breathe. At least, that's how it seemed at first. Then I noticed him. The man who lived directly across the street. He was older, likely in his 70s, with a weathered face and a slow, deliberate way of moving. At first, I barely registered him, assuming he was just another retiree passing the time on his porch. But something about him began to feel off. Every time I pulled into the driveway after work, he was there. Whether it was early in the morning, late at night, or on weekends, he was always sitting on his porch or standing in his yard, staring directly at my house. His gaze wasn't casual or curious, it was sharp and unwavering, like he was watching for something specific. Initially, I tried to shrug it off. People can be eccentric, I told myself. Maybe he was lonely. Maybe he didn't realize how unnerving his constant presence felt. Still, I couldn't shake the unease that crept in every time I caught his eyes locked on me. He never waved. He never smiled. He just watched. One evening, I confided in a friend over the phone, explaining how unsettling it was to feel like I was being monitored every time I came home. My friend laughed it off. Old people get bored, they said. He probably doesn't even realize he's being creepy. I wanted to believe that. I wanted to write it off as harmless. But as the days turned into weeks, the unease grew harder to ignore. His presence began to gnaw at me, slowly eroding the sense of safety I had worked so hard to rebuild. One particularly long day at work left me feeling drained. When I pulled into the driveway that evening, the familiar sight of my neighbor sitting on his porch greeted me. As usual, his gaze followed my every move. I got out of the car, keys jangling in my hand, and tried not to meet his eyes. But I could feel them on me, the weight of his stare pressing against my back as I hurried inside and locked the door behind me. That night, as I was brushing my teeth, I peeked through the bathroom window. The street was dark, illuminated only by the dim glow of the streetlights. His porch light was on, and though I couldn't see him clearly, I knew he was there. Watching. My pulse quickened. I closed the curtain and told myself to let it go. But the unease was impossible to shake. Over the next few weeks, small, unsettling occurrences began to pile up. My backyard gate, which I always kept latched, would be left swinging open when I came home. Items in my yard, garden tools, a chair, were moved, just enough to let me know someone had been there. One Saturday morning, as I mowed the lawn, I felt the unmistakable sensation of being watched. I looked up, and there he was, standing at the edge of his driveway, his eyes fixed on me. I tried to ignore him, focusing on the hum of the mower and the neat lines I was cutting into the grass. But his presence was suffocating, like a shadow I couldn't escape. Finally, I had enough. I cut the engine and walked to the edge of my yard, keeping my tone as even as I could manage. "Can I help you with something?" I called out. He didn't respond. He just stood there, his face blank, his eyes unblinking. The silence stretched between us, heavy and oppressive. My frustration bubbled to the surface. "Look," I said, more firmly this time. "I've noticed you watching me a lot. Is there a problem?" Still, he said nothing. He didn't even acknowledge my words. Instead, after a long pause, he turned and walked back to his house without a single glance back. I stood there, heart pounding, feeling both angry and unnerved. It was as if I didn't exist to him, like I was just an object to observe, not a person to engage with. From that point on, I started avoiding my front yard entirely. I kept the curtains drawn, went out only when absolutely necessary, and made sure all my doors and windows were locked at all times. But even inside, the discomfort lingered. The slightest noise outside, a car passing by, the wind rustling the trees, would send my mind racing. I'd peek through the curtains, half expecting to see him standing there, watching. Then came the night that changed everything. It was late, well past midnight, and I had just drifted off to sleep when I was jolted awake by the sound of footsteps outside my bedroom window. At first, I thought I must have been dreaming, but then I heard it again, the unmistakable crunch of gravel underfoot. My heart pounded as I sat up in bed, straining to listen. The footsteps grew louder, closer. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, my hand shaking as I slid out of bed and crept toward the window. Pulling back the curtain ever so slightly, I peered outside. At first, I saw nothing, just the faint glow of the streetlights casting long shadows across the yard. But then, there he was. Standing in my backyard, less than 10 feet from my window. My breath caught in my throat. He wasn't moving, just standing there, staring directly at me. His face was partially obscured by the shadows, but I could feel the intensity of his gaze. I stumbled back, my pulse racing. Grabbing my phone, I dialed 911, whispering to the operator that someone was in my yard. The minutes that followed felt like hours as I waited for the police to arrive, every sound amplified by my fear. When they finally did, their flashing lights cutting through the darkness, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. But by the time the officers searched the yard, he was gone. There were no footprints, no evidence that he had been there at all. The police took my statement and assured me they would patrol the area, but their words did little to calm my nerves. I spent the rest of the night sitting in the living room with all the lights on, clutching my phone like a lifeline. The next morning, I started packing. I couldn't stay there any longer. The house, the neighborhood, the quiet street that had once felt like a haven now felt like a trap. Within a week, I was gone, leaving behind the place that had once felt like a fresh start. I moved into a bustling part of the city, hoping the noise and crowds would drown out the lingering fear. But even now, in my new apartment, I still find myself glancing over my shoulder, double-checking the locks, and waking up in the middle of the night to check the windows. The memory of my neighbor's unrelenting stare, the sound of his footsteps outside my window, is a shadow I can't escape. Sometimes, the scariest monsters aren't the ones hiding in the dark, they're the ones living right across the street. After a grueling day at work, I pulled into my driveway as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm, amber glow across the street. He was there, as always, seated on his porch with a steaming cup of coffee in hand. I tried to brush off the tension clawing at the back of my mind, pretending not to notice his unwavering gaze as I climbed out of the car. The jangling of my keys felt deafening in the quiet evening, a sound I suddenly wished I could silence. As I moved toward my front door, I felt it, a shift in his energy. Glancing over my shoulder, I froze. He was no longer sitting. He was standing now, his posture rigid, his eyes locked on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. My heart pounded as I turned back to the door, fumbling to get inside and lock it behind me. Safe, but only barely. The unease followed me like a shadow. I tried to focus on my routine, cooking dinner, flipping through channels on the TV, but his image lingered in my mind. The way he had stood there, so still, so focused, sent shivers down my spine. Later, as I prepared for bed, I couldn't resist peeking out the window. The street was dark, save for the dim glow of the streetlights. His house was pitch black, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still there, hidden in the shadows, watching. Over the next few weeks, his presence became impossible to ignore. At first, it was small things, an inexplicable shift in the items in my yard. A garden hose, which I always coiled neatly, would be stretched out across the grass. Footprints would appear in the dirt near the side of my house, even though I hadn't been outside. The back gate, which I always latched, was often found ajar. Then came the night I woke to the sound of footsteps outside my window. At first, I thought it was just the wind rustling through the bushes, but then I heard it again, the distinct crunch of gravel underfoot. My chest tightened as I strained to listen, my heart beat loud in my ears. I reached for my phone, its cold surface grounding me as my hand shook. With the flashlight app on, I hesitated, knowing I shouldn't look but feeling compelled to do so. Slowly, I pulled back the curtain. At first, I saw nothing. The yard was bathed in the faint orange glow of a street lamp, the shadows long and unmoving. But then my eyes adjusted, and I saw him. He was standing there, less than 10 feet away, his silhouette sharp and unmistakable. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He just stared, his presence as oppressive as the darkness surrounding him. A gasp escaped my lips as I stumbled backward, my phone slipping from my grasp and clattering to the floor. My mind raced with fear and disbelief. He was right there, invading the sanctuary of my home with nothing but his eerie stillness. I scrambled to retrieve my phone, dialing 911 with trembling fingers. "He's in my yard," I whispered, my voice quivering as I explained the situation to the operator. "My neighbor, he's outside, watching me." The operator's voice was calm, a lifeline in my moment of terror. "Stay on the line. Officers are on their way." But the minutes that followed felt like an eternity. I crouched in the corner of the room, clutching the phone as if it could shield me from the suffocating fear. My eyes remained fixed on the window, but when the police arrived, he was gone. They searched the yard, their flashlights sweeping across the lawn and bushes, but there was no sign of him, no footprints, no evidence, nothing to prove he had been there at all. I tried to convince myself that I wasn't losing my grip on reality, that what I had seen was real. The police took my statement, their expressions sympathetic but skeptical. Without evidence, there was little they could do. They assured me they would patrol the area, but their words offered no comfort. I knew what I had seen. I knew he had been there. After that night, the paranoia set in like an unwelcome guest, making itself at home in every corner of my mind. I double-checked the locks on every door and window before bed, leaving lights on in every room as if that could ward off the darkness. But the feeling of his gaze, the weight of being watched, never truly left me. I couldn't escape it, not in my home, not in my yard, not even in my dreams. One Saturday morning, I tried to reclaim some sense of normalcy. The lawn needed mowing, and I figured the routine task might help distract me. As I pushed the mower across the grass, I felt it again, that prickling sensation on the back of my neck. I glanced up, and there he was, standing at the edge of his driveway. His posture was relaxed, his hands resting casually at his sides, but his eyes told a different story. They bore into me, unblinking, unrelenting. I gripped the mower's handle tighter, my knuckles white with tension. I tried to ignore him, to focus on the task at hand, but his presence was suffocating. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I cut the engine and walked to the edge of my yard, my frustration bubbling to the surface. "Can I help you with something?" I called out, my voice strained but steady. He didn't respond. He just stood there, staring, as if my words were nothing but background noise. My patience snapped. "Look," I said, louder this time. "I've noticed you watching me. A lot. Is there a problem?" The silence that followed was unbearable. He didn't blink, didn't move. It was as if I didn't exist, as if I were speaking to a statue. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he turned and walked away, disappearing into his house without a word. I stood there, stunned, my heart pounding in my chest. It was as if I didn't matter to him, like I wasn't even worth acknowledging. From that moment on, I avoided the front yard entirely. I kept the blinds drawn and only went outside when absolutely necessary. Even then, I scanned the street and his porch before stepping out, my nerves frayed by the constant sense of being watched. Sometimes he was there, sitting in his usual spot, his gaze as piercing as ever. Other times, his porch was empty, but the feeling of his presence lingered, an invisible weight pressing down on me. As the days turned into weeks, the fear began to consume me. Every creak of the house, every rustle of leaves outside sent my heart racing. The safety I had once felt in my home was gone, replaced by a gnawing dread that I couldn't shake. I knew I couldn't live like this forever. Something had to give, but I wasn't sure what that something would be, or how much more I could endure before it broke me. That evening, exhaustion from a long day weighed heavily on me as I pulled into my driveway. The familiar sense of unease prickled at my skin, and my gaze instinctively flickered toward his house. The porch light glowed dimly, casting long shadows across the yard, but he was nowhere to be seen. For a fleeting moment, I allowed myself to believe that perhaps tonight would be different, that I might finally find a sliver of peace. I hurried inside, locking the door behind me with a click that felt louder than usual in the quiet. I let out a shaky breath I hadn't realized I was holding, trying to calm the tension in my chest. But as I turned toward the kitchen, my heart stopped cold. There, on the table where I always left my keys, was something that shouldn't have been there, a small, crumpled piece of paper, folded neatly in half. My pulse quickened, the sound of my own breathing suddenly too loud in the stillness. I hadn't left anything on the table. I was certain of it. Trembling, I stepped closer, the world narrowing to the note before me. I hesitated, fear coursing through my veins, but my curiosity outweighed my terror. With shaking hands, I picked it up and unfolded it. The message scrawled across the page was messy, almost childlike in its handwriting, but the words were as clear as day, "I see you." A cold wave of dread crashed over me, stealing the air from my lungs. My vision blurred as panic set in, and I stumbled backward, knocking over a chair in my haste. The sound of it clattering to the floor barely registered in my ears. My thoughts raced. How had he gotten inside? How long had he been here? There were no broken locks, no shattered windows, no sign of forced entry anywhere. And yet, this note was undeniable proof that someone had invaded my space, someone who knew exactly how to leave no trace. I grabbed my phone, my fingers fumbling as I dialed 911. My voice trembled as I spoke to the operator, explaining the situation through panicked breaths. "There's a note on my table. Someone's been in my house. I don't know how they got in." "Stay on the line," the operator instructed, her tone steady and reassuring, though it did little to calm the storm raging inside me. "Officers are on their way." Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as I waited, clutching the phone as though it were a lifeline. Every creak of the house, every faint noise outside sent my heart racing anew. My mind replayed every interaction with him, every unnerving glance, every moment I had felt his eyes on me. Had he been watching for weeks, waiting for this exact opportunity? The thought made my skin crawl. When the police finally arrived, their presence brought a brief flicker of relief, but it was short-lived. They searched the house thoroughly, combing through every room and checking every lock and window. Yet, just as before, they found nothing, no fingerprints, no signs of forced entry, no evidence that anyone had been there at all. It was as though he had slipped in and out like a ghost, leaving only the note behind as a chilling reminder of his presence. Their assurances that they would patrol the area did little to comfort me. The note was real. The fear it instilled was real. And yet, without concrete evidence, there was little they could do beyond taking my statement. As the officers left, I stood in the middle of my living room, surrounded by the familiar walls of my home, but it no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a cage. That night, I made the decision I had been avoiding for weeks. I couldn't stay here anymore. The constant dread, the unshakable sense of being watched, the fears that he could return at any moment, it was too much. I packed a bag with the essentials, my movements hurried and frantic, and left without looking back. I stayed with a friend for the next few weeks, trying to put as much distance as possible between myself and the house that had become a nightmare. The process of finding a new place was slow and filled with anxiety. Every potential home felt like a potential trap, every neighbor a potential threat. I scrutinized every detail, every lock, every window, determined to ensure that I would never feel that vulnerable again. When I finally settled into a small apartment in a bustling part of the city, I thought I might be able to start over. The noise of the crowds, the constant hum of activity, it was a stark contrast to the eerie quiet of my old neighborhood, and for a while, it helped. But even now, the memory of that night lingers. The image of his blank stare, the sound of gravel crunching underfoot outside my window, the sight of that note, all of it is seared into my mind, an ever-present shadow that follows me wherever I go. I double-check the locks on my doors and windows every night, sometimes triple-checking just to be sure. I've installed security cameras and motion detectors, but even the blinking red lights of the cameras can't dispel the unease. I never saw him again, and I hope I never will. But the fear he left behind is something I carry with me, a constant reminder that the scariest monsters aren't the ones hiding in the dark, they're the ones who live just a little too close.